Welcome to the Ascent Podcast, a show about inspiring people who explain their path to achievement. I'm your host, Joe Burgess, Wealth Advisor at Moxie Wealth Management. Today on the show, we talk with Jon Lewin, one of the principals at MedCraft Healthcare Real Estate and a founding partner at the Excelsior Brewery in Excelsior, Minnesota. We hear about how Jon came to learn the commercial real estate business and his personal integrity and how he treats his employees and runs his firm. In addition, we learn about his love of the brewery business and his thirst for life and beer outside of work. This episode of The Ascent is intended to be a conversation with our guest, Jon Lewin, on the topic of his professional development. This is not an advertisement for any securities products or investment sectors. Enjoy the show. Jon, welcome. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Good. We have a special treat today. Normally, when we do these podcasts, we're interviewing somebody about their business or their activity or their one thing that they had done. Today, Jon, you've got two businesses that you run, and so now we get to talk about two different ventures that you're part of. The first one being MedCraft Healthcare Real Estate, and the other one is the Excelsior Brewery in Excelsior, Minnesota. So, before we get into the business stuff even, what'd you go to school for?
Well, originally I went to school more to pursue a baseball dream and ended up with a finance degree and an economics minor. And then also ended up getting a commercial real estate add-on, as it was 4 different classes, and a lot of my buddies at the time were taking it, and it started out as, hey, this could be a pretty easy class, and you get credit for your finance degree, but it's one of those things where I found it really interesting from the get-go, and so I went to the University of Northern Iowa, and one of the things about the University of Northern Iowa is it's a teacher's college first, and so I think the split between females and males was 60% females and 40% males.
Nice. They advertise that, don't they?
Depends who they're recruiting.
Okay, right.
And I also I met my beautiful wife down there. She was one of the 60% and was an education major and an elementary school teacher. But they also are known for their business school and their accounting program. Okay. And I knew I didn't want to be an accountant per se, but I always had a really strong interest in the finance aspect of it. My uncle is a stockbroker, and I worked with him on a couple summers trying to understand what that piece was about. I realized I didn't necessarily like the cold calling aspect of being a stockbroker. And when the real estate thing opened up, that was an opportunity to go and work as an intern for a big life insurance company that had an investment into commercial real estate via loans.
Oh, okay.
And so my first job out of school and my first internship was with Aegon down in Cedar Rapids, and that was my first introduction into underwriting and investing in real estate. And we were a lender, so we weren't on the equity side, we were on the debt side, but you still underwrote it like you were an investor or an equity player in the deal. And what was great about that, I mean, this is before there was email and internet. I mean, I think email had just started, but we were still getting packages that were sent via mail, and you'd open the package and you'd have a pretty substantial book, and then you would go through and underwrite it. Well, what was great about it was I was an analyst in the Midwest, the Central States, under a guy by the name of Steve Noonan. And he was a great boss, great mentor, one of those guys that just didn't take business too serious. He was raising young kids at the time, and I was the guy that was there working till 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night because I didn't have anything else better to do. But I got to see so many different deals, apartment deals, industrial deals, office deals, retail deals, different parts of the country, why they worked, why they didn't, why would we do a loan on them. And that was kind of my first introduction into investing into the real estate. And that's when I figured, I'm like, from a finance perspective, this is what I wanted to do. So I had one more semester to finish up at the University of Northern Iowa, and then they hired me full-time at Aegon.
So you start out at Aegon, and I know you eventually get recruited to a company called Amoresco out of Texas, doing commercial mortgage-backed securities lending. But how do you end up finally getting back to Minnesota?
So quick segue, I was in Dallas, Texas doing this. Minnesota raised. I spent my first 2 summers. We broke records. I think it was like 59 straight days of over 100 degrees. I was playing softball on a team. Our first games, the earliest games, would start at 9 o'clock. I didn't figure that out until the first one I went to, and I asked them, like, why are we starting at 9 o'clock? And they said, because the sun went down. It's still 95 degrees and you're sweating and you're out there playing. I learned why people put the things in their windshields so their steering wheel doesn't melt.
Right.
And after 2 summers of that, really 3 summers, I couldn't do it another summer.
Right.
So CMBS world was crashing. It all really started with a small blip. The Russian ruble crisis and the Asian flu that hit in the late 90s hurt a lot of CMBS lenders because there's always a flight to quality when there's a bump or a hiccup in the markets. And one of the things is people said, we're not going to do CMBS anymore. And all of a sudden, all those fundings went away. The spreads that we had on our loans were underwater. And we weren't a company that was capitalized enough to survive that. And so ultimately, Ameresco went into bankruptcy. I was kept on, so the majority of our group was let go, but I was kept on to work out a lot of the assets and a lot of the loans that were there. The only reason I was kept on is because I was cheap. They weren't paying me a ton, and they could get a lot out of me. And when my boss finally left, I said, I'm leaving too. Make sure I get a package just like you did. Funny, right? I mean, I get a package like he is, but at that point I said I was going to move back to Minnesota.
So you come back to Minnesota, and I know you ultimately end up at a real estate development company called Frauenschuh. Tell me about that.
So I knew of Frauenschuh just because I had worked Minnesota from a loan standpoint, and one of the mortgage bankers that I worked with actually introduced me to him. He had done a bunch of loans with them and said, hey, they have a couple really dynamic guys, and they have made their niche in the healthcare real estate market. And I said, that's kind of interesting. So I went and met with Dave Frauenschuh, Richard Wicca, and Ron Smith. Ron is a former Alina exec. Richard Wicca is an architect by background, and David is a very successful entrepreneur who has made his living in the real estate world, but has also ventured out and done other investments. And David is a very big-hearted man, so right away, I liked David. He's a very likable person, and I could tell that Richard and Ron were driven, and I liked their style. And the one thing I never wanted to do from a development standpoint was go and work on one deal. And that's kind of the majority of the developers that are out there. They'll do one big deal, and it might take 3 to 4 or 5 years to get that deal done, and you're constantly working on that one deal. And I just knew my personality that I couldn't sit still long enough and focus on just one project at all the time. So from what they had, and they had all these projects that were going, I thought this might be pretty interesting because I can come in, I can use my finance background. They hired me to be really just to place debt on their properties, find bank debt and permanent debt for their properties, and their strategy was to develop and then hold these properties for the long term.
Okay.
So that's how I got on the development side.
And throughout this whole time, as it turns out now, there's a couple of businesses that you're at least part owner in. Throughout this time, were you thinking someday I'm going to own this company? Or, I mean, did you have any itch of like, man, I think I understand this stuff. Maybe I don't want to work for somebody anymore. What were you thinking?
I've gone back and forth on this. I mean, from the standpoint of my personality, I am a finance guy at heart, meaning that I do have a lot of conservative pieces to the way that my brain ticks. And I didn't think that I ever had it in me to really be a Dave Frauenschuh in terms of being an entrepreneur. But Dave said one thing to me early on is, I don't invest in buildings, I invest in people. And at the time, his big investment was in Ron and Richard. And that piece stuck with me, just in terms of, because I think that I'm a really good complement to entrepreneurs, and that'll work maybe a little bit into the Excelsior Brewing conversation, because I'm not the one with the idea, but I can help execute on that idea, and I'm really good on the finance. I think I'm really good on the finance side.
Your track record would say you're okay, right?
Yeah. And I knew that I could get the financing that they needed for their projects, and I knew I could do it in a way where we could grow without having to sell our assets, because the way that we worked was as we were working with large hospitals and health systems across the country. And one of the things that they wanted to know, if they're not going to own their own assets, which are core assets to what they're doing within that particular community, they wanted to make sure that they had a trusted owner and partner that knew what they were going to do, and that weren't going to just get in there and flip the assets and take a big profit and hand it off to some institution that is going to change asset managers every other week, and they're never going to know who is on point for their particular project.
How does Frauenschuh then shift to MedCraft? And you're part owner in MedCraft, right?
I am.
And you weren't part owner in Frauenschuh. What was that transition? What happened there?
The way that all of our projects are done, they're all in separate LLCs, and this goes back to Dave, Ron, and Richard. They were pretty adamant in terms of key personnel within the organization having an ownership in those projects. And Dave likes to tell the story. That's how he got his start. So there was a Chicago developer, Chuck Palmer, that came up to the St. Paul and started investing heavily into the St. Paul office market. He brought Dave on as the property manager and then put him in ownership of some of those projects. So that's where Dave got his start, and he's been paying it forward ever since. I was very fortunate. He didn't have to allow me to invest in these projects. I had to invest my own dollars, but he gave me that opportunity. And when we started recapitalizing these projects with equity partners, I was in a position where I started to gain some funds that it was great, because that gave me my taste and reward, I guess, of on the development side. So how we transitioned was back to 2008. We funded a $125 million hospital project down in Nebraska, and we did that with a publicly traded REIT. So they came in and co-invest with us on those.
On a new project.
On existing and new. And so part of what they came and said, hey, we want to be your partner on this hospital project. We also want to be your partner on other projects as well. And so they came in and were our partners in terms of co-investing with us on those assets.
Okay. So eventually, my understanding here is the REIT, who invested in one of those projects, they decide, I think, to work with you and try to bring the development team in-house, which means now your team goes from Frauenschuh to being employed by the REIT. And this one happens to be based out of Toledo, which would mean that you once again would have to start doing more traveling out of state. Did you want any part of that, or was that going to be a deal breaker for you?
Yeah, I don't know if it was a deal breaker by any means, but it was presented as almost kind of a deal breaker, basically as John, you go with this group, otherwise maybe the deal doesn't happen. And so there was a little pressure also that way too, that, hey, I guess I'm going to go do this. It was there was a courting process, and they were an investor of ours for a few years. And, and what I loved about it was we got to stay somewhat autonomous. I mean, the name Frauenschuh stayed, so we got to represent to our clients that we are still Frauenschuh. The way that we structured it was, Ron, Richard, and David were a management group outside of the REIT. So, that piece of it was really important, and we spent a lot of time, really a lot of time on the integration and how this was going to ultimately go down, because at the end of the day, we were really concerned about our relationships, our hospital relationships and clients. We wanted to make sure that we were still the local group that had the principals and executives at the table making decisions along with the hospital, so we didn't have to go back to an investment committee. And so setting that up took a lot of time, and really I give the REIT a lot of credit as well, just because they were going out on a risk too. I mean, developers are always compared to cowboys. I wouldn't say that we were cowboys by any means. We were very specific in what we were doing. And again, I mean, Ron and Richard are two of the best business people I've ever worked with, period. And they were driven, and they knew what risks they could take and what they couldn't. And they were also very specific about the groups that they wanted to work with. And so they didn't want to see all that hard work that they'd put in, all the time on planes, all the time in hospital boardrooms, go to waste because somebody wanted to change the name of the company and the relationship. So that piece was really important.
So I know you're with the REIT for about 5 years, and then a new CEO comes in to take control of that REIT, and he has kind of a different vision and decides maybe it'd be better for the development part to roll back out into your own entity, which would become MedCraft. I want to know more about how did that happen? How did that come about?
His strategy and his dream of how he could grow this company wasn't on doing $300 million in development on an annual basis. He wanted to do $1 billion to $2 billion. And in order to do that, he had to have multiple developers because we're one of the largest healthcare real estate developers in the country, but we can only cover so much. And there's other developers that are just like us that do a really, really good job that compete in that space, and they wanted to be able to co-invest with them as well. And so ultimately, they came to me and said, hey, would you be interested in spinning off the development platform? They were going to keep the property management side of it, but they wanted to spin off that development platform. And at that point in my life, I could see the writing on the wall. I was either going to have to move to Toledo, Ohio, save your Toledo jokes, and Toledo is actually, every town and every part of this country is amazing, and they have their own fabric there, and I really got to know and love the people in Toledo, and then also get to explore the city a little bit, and there's a lot to offer there, but I wasn't going to move my family. So raising 3 boys at the time, it was Jack, I think, was 10, so I had 10, 8, and 6. Yeah, I wasn't going to uproot my family, move away from my family and friends here in Minnesota for a job. That's just not the way I'm built. And it's funny, and I've had these conversations at 2 crossroads in my life, the first being the Atlanta job with ING, and then again with the REIT. The question comes to you, well, what kind of package would make it feasible for you to move? And my response both times is, I can't put a number on it. $1 billion, I don't know if it's, $1 million. I just can't put a number on it. Because to me, at some point, people always say this, but money is not the driver. I wanted to be here. I wanted to be in Minnesota. I wanted to be able to continue to enjoy the life that I had. I've got a great life, so and great friends. So that was an easy decision. I wasn't going to move to Toledo.
And so turning that down then meant you needed to create your own development company.
So the way that it worked was we had a bunch of projects that we were managing that were under construction, and so the way that it was structured and the way that it was exited was so great. And I'll give a lot of credit to the REIT. When we transitioned to MedCraft, we already had projects that were under construction. And the way that our operation works is we charge a development fee to the project. And that development fee really goes to keep the lights on. It pays for our staff and our folks and our marketing and all the little things that you do to run a business. And so we had that from day one. So it wasn't as if we were starting with no clients, no projects, nothing. We had a nice little runway to start.
Now, as it turns out, and as MedCraft gets developed, it's you and 2 other partners that are the principals there. You mentioned before that you're a finance guy and you felt like you're more of a complement to maybe getting things done. Is that still your role now, or do you feel like amongst the 3 of you, or is that really expanded to something different where you say, now I like steering the ship a little bit?
From a culture standpoint, I knew the culture that I wanted to have at the organization, and the culture was invest not only in the people that are there, but make sure that they're happy and they're comfortable. And we've really kept the same staff. Nobody left. I'm sure that there was a lot of questions. First it was, hey, we really like the comfort of Frauenschuh, and having Dave Frauenschuh there and Ron and Richard is a good, comfortable feeling. There's some things that probably weren't great as well, but then you move to the institutional world, and we tried hard to make sure that we didn't get institutionalized. within our development group. And I think we did a fairly good job of that, but a lot of the corporate stuff started to creep in, whether it's, the wellness programs or the stuff that you need to motivate people that need to be motivated. Mm-hmm. And that just isn't our group. Our folks are so dedicated to the hospitals and the health systems and the communities that they work in. That's their motivation. Ultimately what we do at MedCraft, and we talk about this all the time, is, we're building a building for that hospital and health system to deliver the best health care within that community. And one of the things that we've learned over our history, and we're going on 35 years starting back in the Frauenschuh days, but really from where we've evolved, we're probably about 15 years, 20 years into this new model, and we spend a lot of time on the programming side. So we take analytics and we help hospitals and health systems make sure that they are getting the right space, utilizing the space. We've changed how physicians and practitioners actually help patients. You hear a lot about the Disney on stage, off stage. Mm-hmm. We've implemented that into our projects. And really what we've done is we've eliminated space. And if you talk to a typical real estate developer, you're like, well, why do you eliminate space? You want to build the building bigger. That way it's a bigger project. You can charge them more rent. Right. Well, no, we want to make sure in today's healthcare world where there's so much compression on pricing and there's so much pressure on how that healthcare is delivered, we want to make sure that the real estate aspect of it is the most efficient as it possibly can get. Mm-hmm. And we use the term, we want to make sure that the building's working really, really hard for the client. Mm-hmm. And that's our motivating factor to make sure, and we follow up on it too. We just had a couple folks that were out in Baltimore on a project that we opened 2 years ago, and we're not getting paid for that trip. We wanted to go out and we wanted to do some studies and analytics and see, are they using the space that we thought the way that we designed it? And how's that affecting them? Are the physicians happy? Are the nurse practitioners happy? Are the patients happy? Right? Is this the right location? Are they doing the things that they wanted to do? Did the elimination of the waiting room really help? Are patients able to find their way to their different exam rooms? Are they feeling like they're getting the time with their doctor? And is the doctor feeling like they're practicing at an optimal pace?
And is all of this follow-up research kind of what you're using as you move forward and develop new projects? In other words, that's your reinforcement to people and saying, listen, this is what we've done. We've studied it. We've studied the follow-up. We see how it's affected. And this is where we think we can bring to the table when we develop your next clinic of what we ought to do, right?
Yeah. So one of the stats we always throw out is we've been rehired 57 times by 17 leading health systems. And that one means a lot to us just because once we get hired for that first project, we tend to do multiple projects for them because they like our approach. They like the folks that we're working with, and ultimately we deliver on projects. So the capital's there, and there's a good, strong, fundamental base of doing a project with MedCraft that they know that it's going to get done. They don't have to worry about whether or not we're going to get the bank financing or there's going to be a hiccup with the contractor.
Now that you're in a leadership role, are you paying it forward the way David Frauenschuh paid it forward way back when?
Yeah, we've taken it maybe even a little step further. And one of the things, too, from a culture standpoint, we're a big believer that people, given the tasks at hand, are going to find a way to get the job done. So I never spend any time in dealing with HR issues because somebody missed a meeting, or we don't say, hey, you need to be there at your desk at 8:00. That's not what we say. We say, hey, if you have a 9:00 call, if you need to be in the office for it, then be in the office. But if you can take that call from your house because you have to get your kid to school or you need a parent-teacher conference, a good buddy of mine says this all the time, work's an activity, not a place. And we say that and we live it and we mean it because I don't really care when people are coming and going. I just want to make sure that the client's happy and what they're expected to get done gets done. And we don't have an issue with it. And so we set that culture in that environment. And the other piece is everybody knows what we're doing. We're developing projects from an investment standpoint. So really at the end of the day, we talk about we're a healthcare developer, and we're helping hospitals and health systems deliver this, but really we're investing our own money, and this is an investment vehicle for us in the healthcare real estate space, and we want to make sure that everybody that's involved with our organization gets to taste that, gets to live that a little bit. So every single person is involved in our investments, and we invest the money for them, but upon a certain return, they get a promoted interest. And so when these projects are completed and finished, and we bring in our capital partner, then will give us basically what would amount to a completion fee, and the people that are part of MedCraft get to share in that.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I imagine that a lot of your employees feel a sense of purpose and meaning and valued.
I don't think they believed us until the first one happened. Like, that's great, John.
Yeah,
here's the finance guy.
Yeah,
here's the finance guy talking about the finance stuff again. And, he says this is going to happen, but whatever. But it did. In our first project, we finished in actually locally here in Buffalo for Alina, and it was great. Some of the amounts aren't huge, but it's all relative too. I mean, what we don't think might be a huge amount it could be a tremendously huge amount, whether it covers a vacation or Christmas presents or college education for their kids or whatever they want to use it for, renovation to their house. It's savings, for retirement. I think that by doing this, it's a bonus outside of the bonus that they get to. They don't rely on it. They know that what the nature of our business is. But when we're sitting in a Monday morning meeting talking about our pipeline, they understand that, hey, what do we need to do in order to help get this project done? Right. Because ultimately they're going to enjoy the benefits of that.
Fantastic. Well, so before we run out of time, because I feel like we could talk for a long time on MedCraft alone. At some point in time, we did invest in the Excelsior Brewery.
Yes.
How long has the brewery been around?
Yeah, so everyone always asks me, how did this start? This started with baseball. My oldest son, Jack, was 4 at the time, and my 2 partners from Excelsior, Patrick Foss and John Click, also had 4-year-old boys, and I was the coach. Yep. And John Click is one of these guys that is a big idea guy. And he, going back to David Frauenschuh's advice to me, invest in people, not projects. He was in kind of the trinkets and trash business, selling, beads and anything that you would get from like a Budweiser or a Heineken. That are
promotional gifts.
Yeah,
kind of
right.
Stuff, yeah.
And so he was going to these craft beer conferences, and he saw how it was growing across the country. And so we started working on a business plan. I was just finishing up my master's at Carlson at the University of Minnesota. And, it was one of those things where I was studying at night and, put the kids down, study at night, and then, go to work in the morning. Well, all of a sudden my nights became free. And so,
right.
Why not spend it, put the kids down and go spend it maybe having a pint and working on a business plan for a brewery. So we originally started with the concept of basing a local craft brewery around Lake Minnetonka. I grew up there, on the west side, on the Mound side of Lake Minnetonka. And I always like to say the Mound folks know how to use the lake more than anybody else that lives on the lake all year round. And, it's just one of those things that has been a thread in my upbringing, and I live there now, and I can't imagine living anywhere else. It's a wonderful place to live, and you have this great town of Excelsior on the South Shores that really needed a spark, and this is coming off the recession, so businesses were closing, and there wasn't a lot of really great things happening, probably around the country, but especially in Excelsior. And so we had a proactive mayor, and he said, hey, whatever you can do to maybe potentially get a business in here, great. So this is before tap rooms. We were just going to do a production brewery.
They had legislation change right around that time, though.
Yeah, and everyone knows it as the Surly Bill. The ones that get forgotten in that is Fulton was actually had a big part of that. There's a couple attorneys that are part of their ownership group. And they talked to us, they talked to Liftbridge, they talked to Indeed. So a lot of the breweries that we were starting up with at the same time we all kind of got together and we were calling our legislators and writing letters and doing that stuff. And you needed a face, and Omar from Surly was the face of it and became the Surly Bill. So we were the third tap room in the state of Minnesota open because we saw the opportunity. We truly only thought about it as a tasting room. And again, the city of Excelsior was great to work with. They didn't know what the heck this thing was going to be, right? I mean, we were all kind of, working on more of based on what we knew what was happening out west in Colorado and Oregon. And, Minnesota has liquor laws that are still a bit challenging even today. But this was one of the first ones where it opened up the opportunity to have local fresh craft beer produced in a town like Excelsior that was going to be available to the public in our tap room. And it took off from there.
Well, and it's because of that, Bill, that now craft breweries have just exploded, right? I mean, the finances wouldn't work if you couldn't have a tap room for most people, right?
And it's interesting, and because we've learned that maybe the hard way, but we're still a distribution brewery, and that's been the biggest challenge for us. And part of it is it goes back to undergrad. And I mean, when you learn about an industry that has hot growth, then it ultimately levels off in that bell curve, and then businesses start to go away because of the competition, because there's this oversaturation of those businesses, and that's what you're seeing today. And the difference is the ones that opened and can serve a neighborhood or a particular area, I think are going to be able to survive because that's what their business plan was going in, because it said, hey, we're going to make great beer. But we're really just going to have a tap room, and maybe we sell a couple kegs to the local restaurants. But for the most part, we're going to concentrate on our neighborhood and be in that local craft beer to the neighborhood.
So what would you say now for somebody who, he's got his two other buddies, they play softball together, and they've said, hey, I think I've got a great beer now, or I think it'd be fun, I want to do it. What would your advice be to anybody who was starting a brewery now?
Don't do it. No, it's like any business, and I'll tell you, my struggles right now at this particular moment is I don't have the time to spend with the brewery that I'd like to spend, because it's a fun business, and it's different than MedCraft, and the employees there, again, I mean, from the day that we opened, when we had people that came and said, hey, I want to volunteer and pour beer for you, are still pouring beer for us. And my youngest brother is our head brewer. He came and built out our brewery. And our head brewer at the time, Bob Duvenois, one of the legends in Minnesota, when he was making the tough decision to leave the brewery that he helped start, he said, hey, you don't have to go outside of what we have. Niles is your guy. And so that's been fun too, is to watch him shine and grow within that company. But Ron Lemmerman been there from day one. I mean, it's and I'm going to miss a bunch of names, but I mean, it's been great just to see the loyalty there, because it's a lifestyle job. And, and that's been one of the tough things to navigate, because you have to have people that are there for the lifestyle, not the income. Where at MedCraft, they love what they do, but they're also compensated for it at a higher level. And so managing a business that's more of that lifestyle business can have its, tricks to it.
It seems like, obviously, through our dialogue today, that the core of your knowledge base and where maybe you get to flex your mental muscles is more on the real estate development side. But ideally, would you want to someday not do that and do brewery full time, or do you like your role as it is in the brewery?
I would love nothing better than full time to go catch bottles off the bottling line, scrape grains, pour some beer, talk to the locals in the tap room and spend time there. I mean, who wouldn't?
Right.
I mean, again, describing just in terms of a lifestyle job versus a professional job. The tough part about any job that requires travel and time away from your family, it starts to wear on you. And I kind of joke now, the second that I don't have any status on Delta, I'm going to celebrate.
Right.
Yeah, I'd love nothing better than to get on my boat in the summer and drive, go across
into the brewery.
to the brewery, or get on my bike, or
Yeah.
get to do the stuff that I like to do. I'm an active outdoors guy, and I would love nothing more than to have that lifestyle, day-to-day duties.
Right. What do you think you've learned professionally, or maybe what do you think is the thing that, I ended up where I ended up, but this is what I learned from business, and here's what I think are some of the most important values?
Well, I'm still learning, and I think one is respecting people. And, the one thing I think that I try to make sure that from a self-learning standpoint is numbers have always come pretty easy to me. Finance has come pretty easy to me. And this goes back to where we started. I mean, I saw so many deals in my lending days that I can do it in my sleep. I mean, I can look at a pro forma and probably pick the number that's out wrong with hardly a glance. So I know what I'm strong at. What I'm not strong at is being able to explain that and always thinking to myself, wow, this is really simple. Why doesn't everybody else get it? And so I'm taking a complicated potential situation and being able to simplify it to where everybody can agree and understand it. And, I think that's the tough part. I'm not one to I don't like making tough, hard decisions as it relates to people. I always think that every decision we make has an effect on that individual who has a family, who has kids, who has, parents that might be in a spot where they're needed. So that's the hard part for me, is that owning businesses is a human aspect to it. And probably over the last 2 years, I never. People always say, I'm losing sleep over this. And I'm like, what are you losing sleep for? I sleep great. And and I can tell you that there's been some hard moments there. I mean, last year we didn't break ground on a single deal at MedCraft, right? So, I mean, again, in order to keep the operations going, we need those developments to be going. And the thing that I worry about is not myself. I think about, oh my God, what happens if, right? I mean, if we don't need 3 project managers, we don't need this person, holy cow, that's going to have a tremendous effect on their family. And they're such great people, they get hired in a heartbeat. Right. But getting hired in a heartbeat to a different organization that they're not accustomed to, that's a life change. And now all of a sudden, what if they're stuck in a 2 to 5 year spiral of not being in the right spot? This is stuff I think about. It's weird, but I just those are my biggest learnings and takeaways. People ask me all the time, it must be great to own businesses. It's not. There's a lot of times where I'm like, I wish I just was an employee, because you take that stress of all the different things that could potentially happen to that particular business. In the brewery, it's weekly, just the little things, whether you hear about a beer that went bad, or, we used to get worried about this, I don't anymore, but, somebody does a bad Yelp review, something to that effect, or somebody calls and said, hey, we weren't treated right. And you're like, oh my goodness, how do we fix this? But also, try to understand the whole story behind it. So there's a lot of challenges that you just on a day-to-day basis, you're just like, I don't know if I want to deal with all that stuff.
To kind of finish up here, what do you see moving forward? I mean, you just mentioned you take on the stress of having the businesses. Is it something that you're addicted to, or are you somebody that says, hey, the average person, you're 45 now, right? And they work till some people never retire. Some people move on to be chairman of the board, and they're always involved.
Yeah.
Do you see yourself as somebody that's gonna be your path, or at least even out into your 60s, or do you see yourself saying, maybe I kind of want to get what I get out of this and transition?
Yeah, no chance. I don't care what I drive. I like nice things, but the big thing for me is my wife Jessica is just a tremendous mother, and she a lot of times I'm gone and she has to get the kids to hockey or baseball or whatever it happens to be. I'd love to be that person. And Jack is a freshman in high school. Tommy is a 7th grader, and Max is a 5th grader. I mean, I look at that and say, gosh, I would really love to be in a position where, I can I coach their sports now, but how can I be with them even more to help them through this part of their life? And I don't want to hold their hand, but I want to live it with them. And you know me really well. I mean, I love to snowboard. I love being out west. I love being in the mountains. Being on a fly fishing trip or going up a mountain with you.
Right.
That sort of stuff. I mean, those challenges and those journeys, I think, really, help from an overall personal development standpoint, because you take away so much from different cultures of just the places that you visit. People always say, "Oh, I'm bored in retirement." No way, that's not me. I'll figure out a million different things to keep me going on a daily basis.
Great. Jon, I think that's all I have time for. And it was fun really getting a better handle on how MedCraft came to be and your perspective on the brewery and other things. I had a good time. It was great.
Yeah, well, thank you. Appreciate it.
You've been listening to Jon Lewin, Principal at MedCraft Healthcare Real Estate and founding partner at the Excelsior Brewery. To learn more about MedCraft and the work they do, you can find them online at medcraft.com. To get a sense of the Excelsior Brewery, you can find them at Excelsior Brew, EXCELSIOR brew.com, or just stop by the Pint Room in downtown Excelsior. On our next episode, we speak with Bill Laney, a retired orthopedic surgeon who at age 70 rode his bike all the way across the United States. Some of his inspiration came from a book called The Oregon Trail.
My son Mike gave me this book on the Oregon Trail, and I started reading it. Well, it was about a fellow who asked his brother to go cross country following the Oregon Trail in a covered wagon drawn by oxen, just like his father had given them a ride when they were young. On the back of the covered wagon, he had a sign, the same sign his father had on the back of his wagon when he took the boys on the ride. It was "See America Slowly." One of the best books I've ever read.
We hear more details about his cross-country adventure, the people he met, the vistas, and the hardships. Further, we'll hear his perspective on living a meaningful life in retirement. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Ascent Podcast, a show about inspiring people who explain their path to achievement. I'm your host, Joe Burgess, wealth advisor and founding partner of Moxie Wealth Management. You can learn more about me and my firm at moxiewealthmanagement.com. That's MOXIE wealthmanagement.com. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.